Good evening. I'm Tom Maloney. I'm the chair of the Department of Economics and the director of the Barbara and Norman Tanner Center for Nonviolent Human Rights Advocacy at the University of Utah. And it's my privilege to welcome you to the start of our 8th annual conference on human rights, conflict resolution, nonviolence, and peace. And our theme this year is Building Peace in the 21st Century, Global Ethical Dialogues. The program has been developed in collaboration with the Global Ethics Network of the Carnegie Council for Ethics and International Affairs. And our purpose is to reflect on this year, 2014, as the centennial of the founding of the Carnegie Council and also the centennial of the start of World War I, and to consider some of the threats to peace that are most pressing in our time, including environmental degradation, economic inequality, and violence by non-state actors. We'll examine these challenges and potential sources of their resolution, or at least their amelioration, beginning tonight and continuing in panels tomorrow on the University of Utah campus, starting at 8:30 a.m. The conference program will be available in the atrium afterward, and the conference is free, and we invite all of you to come and participate in that conversation. Our ability to engage in this work is the result of the great generosity of the Barbara and Norman Tanner family, and I want to thank them again for their vision in establishing the center and for their extraordinarily generous ongoing support. Please join me in thanking them. A number of other departments and centers at the university, as well as other local organizations, help to make the conference possible every year through a variety of kinds of support. And so I want to thank our partners, including the College of Social and Behavioral Science, which is where our center resides, the S.J. Quinney College of Law, which will be hosting a keynote address by David Roden of Oxford University and the Carnegie Council tomorrow at 12:15 in the Moot Courtroom as part of this program. I want to thank the College of Humanities, which is the home to our sister curricular program, the Peace and Conflict Studies program, as well as the Tanner Humanities Center, the David Eccles School of Business, the Honors College, the Office of the Vice President for Institutional Advancement, all at the University of Utah, and also, of course, the Salt Lake City Public Library for hosting tonight's event, and also a reception following, which I hope you all will attend, and a screening last night of the film Inequality for All, which we held in collaboration with the Utah Film Center, which kind of kicked off the consideration of these issues, especially the issue of economic inequality. And I also want to thank the Tanner McMurran Lecture Series Endowment at Westminster College for their very generous support, as well as co-sponsors and other funders at the university, including the Center for Global Justice and the College of Law. This is a relatively new center at the university. It's headed by Erica George and Amos Giora of the law school. And it's doing very exciting and important work on human rights and justice issues, and I encourage you to investigate their work if you are unfamiliar with them. As well as the Department of Economics, the International Studies Program at the University of Utah, and the Center for the Study of Ethics at Utah Valley University. I want to thank the center staff, including Alita Tu and Victoria Medina, as well as Dean Chatterjee of the S.J. Quinney College of Law, also a Carnegie Council Global Ethics Fellow, whom you'll hear from in a second, and who led the conference planning this year. And finally, we're especially grateful to the University of Utah's Office for Global Engagement for sponsoring tonight's keynote address and our reception. It's always a great pleasure to collaborate with their office, which is headed by the university's Chief Global Officer, Michael Hardman. And I'd like to ask Mike Hardman now to say a few words of welcome.
Well, good evening, everyone, and I do promise to be brief. It is my pleasure, on behalf of President Pershing and the university's Office for Global Engagement, to welcome you to this 8th annual Forum on Peace in the 21st Century, sponsored by the Tanner Center. The Office for Global Engagement is certainly very proud to be sponsoring tonight's keynote, as this is one of our very first international events since we became part of the university this past fall. Yes, we're only 6 months old. As the U's newest campus-wide operation, our responsibilities include supporting the nearly 3,000 international students who are on the university's campus each year, hundreds of visiting global scholars who come to the university, as well as expanding the U's student learning abroad experiences, our global internship programs and partnerships with the Hinckley Institute, regional campuses, including our new U Asia campus, which will open in September of 2014, and international programs with partner universities from around the world. All that said, truly, in order for us to successfully meet the U Global Vision, we must also seek to engage and support opportunities for our faculty and students to move out of the too often ethnocentric American dialogue to a truly global interaction and exchange, which is why we see our participation in the Tanner Center Forum as critical to not only discussing, analyzing, and understanding the many challenges in today's world, but doing something about the fate of the world's citizens. And so tonight, in the spirit of this forum, I'm pleased to make a very special announcement, a new partnership between the Office for Global Engagement and the Tanner Center that will embark on an important initiative to become part of the internationally recognized Scholars Rescue Fund and engage the University of Utah for the first time in hosting threatened scholars from war-torn countries on our campus each year, hopefully starting next year. With the generous support from the Sorensen Legacy Foundation and support from participating U colleges, we hope to have our first global scholar on the campus in the next academic year. And in doing so, the University of Utah joins a group of over 300 institutions worldwide who have stepped up to bring these brilliant and committed scholars to safety, enabling them to continue their research and teaching. I want to acknowledge Sherry Daly. Sherry, why don't you stand up? Our Director for Development and External Relations, there she is, in the Office for Global Engagement. She's taken the lead on this incredible partnership. And we want to extend an invitation to each of you, to anyone who would like more information about this program. I believe we have some written material out front, and Sherry has graciously agreed to be at the reception tonight to answer any questions that you might have. So we certainly encourage you to learn more about this very, very important initiative. In concluding my very brief welcome, I certainly want to acknowledge and congratulate Tom Maloney and Dean Chatterjee, as well as their amazing support staff for all the time and effort that has gone into making this forum a reality. And I wish each of you as conference participants a very productive and meaningful experience over the next day. I thank you, and I would now welcome Dean Chatterjee to the microphone.
Good evening, and thank you for coming here to this evening's program. It's my distinct honor and pleasure to introduce the keynote speaker for the evening, and I'm going to do it. But before I do that, I do like to pause for a moment and reflect on a dear friend for all of us in this community that we lost. Just a little over maybe 2 months ago, we lost him. He had been a constant source of presence and inspiration for all of us, and we had such joy being with him, and he had been a big supporter and promoter of our efforts and programs. He is Professor David Keller. He was Professor David Keller, still is with us always, at Utah Valley University, and also the director. He was the director of the Center for the Study of Ethics at UVU. And as the director, he made that center a real big hub for the study of ethics, one of the best in the entire country, if I might say, in terms of its activities and engagement. And he was, in fact, a truly gentle, colossus, gentle presence with us. And his gentle greatness has influenced us in so many ways. We do miss his energetic, cheerful, and generous nature. In fact, as I speak these words, I almost can hear his boisterous words and big laughter. We were so fortunate to have him with us. Now that we don't have him now with us here, now is our time to remember and reflect on his gentle greatness. He taught us so much, both in his lifetime as well as in his death. He suffered for a while, and yet his undaunted spirit stayed on, and that was quite amazing. He never gave up on life, even as he was dying. We will truly miss him. Having said that, I would like to introduce our very distinguished speaker. We were very fortunate to have him for this occasion. He really fits the bill that we had in mind. He is Professor Marc Coicaud. He is Professor of Law and Global Affairs and Director of the Division of Global Affairs at Rutgers University. He is a Global Ethics Fellow with the Carnegie Council in Ethics in International Affairs. In the spring of 2013, he served as the Roberts Buffet Visiting Professor of International and Comparative Studies at Northwestern University. Professor Coicaud holds a PhD in political science and law and also a doctorate in political theory, both from institutes and universities in Paris. And he holds also undergraduate and graduate degrees in philosophy, literature, and linguistics. He's quite versatile, as you can see. He has published over 14 books and more than 60 chapters and articles in the fields of comparative politics, political and legal theory, international relations, and international law. His books are available in English, French, Japanese, Chinese, Spanish, and Arabic. Prior to joining Rutgers, Professor Coicaud served as the director of the United Nations University Office at the United Nations headquarters in New York City. Earlier, he was senior academic officer and director of studies at the United Nations University headquarters in Tokyo. He also served in the Executive Office of the United Nations Secretary General as a speechwriter for Dr. Boutros Ghali, and also served as an advisor at the Guatemalan office of the United Nations Department of Political Affairs. And listen to this, in this context, when he was at the United Nations and working in the Secretary General's office, he got involved in helping to address the various conflicts of the period of the time in the 1990s that the United Nations had in part the responsibility to try to stop. And then he was also involved in the processes of peace building and country reconstruction once the conflicts had stopped. So he is not only an academic, but also he had been in the trenches, so to speak, and he has these both sides. And so that's why what he says and what he can tell us would be that interesting for us to hear. A former fellow at Harvard University, at the University Center for International Affairs, Department of Philosophy, and Harvard Law School, Professor Coicaud has held appointments such as cultural attaché with the French Ministry of Foreign Affairs and legislative aid with the European Parliament. He also has been a visiting professor at the École Normale Supérieure in Paris, Chuo Law School in Tokyo, Inter-American University of Puerto Rico School of Law in San Juan, and has taught at the New School for Social Research in New York City. And also, in addition, he has been a senior fellow at the United States Institute of Peace in Washington, D.C., a global research fellow at New York University School of Law, and a visiting scholar at the School of Public Policy and Management of Tsinghua University in Beijing. He has lectured extensively throughout the world, and this is his first visit in Salt Lake City, and with great enthusiasm and optimism, we welcome him here to give his keynote. Thank you.
Thank you, and good evening. And thank you very much, Professor Chatterjee, for your kind, very kind introduction and welcome. I also want to thank the organizers of the conference and the Barbara and Norman Tanner Center for Non-Violent Human Rights Advocacy for inviting me to attend this week's conference and deliver a presentation this evening. And thank you for taking the time to be here this evening. This is a great honor, and I'm truly grateful for it. I have to confess that this is my first time in Utah and in Salt Lake City, and from what I have seen so far, it's a very impressive place. So I'm truly very glad to be here today and this evening. So when the organizers of the conference asked me to deliver this evening's presentation, Dean suggested that in line with the overall theme of this year's conference organized by the Tanner Center, a good topic would be international dialogue and peace in the 21st century. Needless to say, this is a very big topic to address in the 40 minutes or so that I have for my presentation, but I agreed with the organizers, and I would be happy to try to share with you this evening a few thoughts on the topic. And in this regard, I thought that rather than giving you an historical overview of the state of international dialogue and peace in the 21st century, we would need much more than 40 minutes. I would give you a more personal take and account, if you will, of the topic of international dialogue and peace in the current era. I hope you will not mind. Because sometimes being a bit personal on a given abstract topic and international dialogue and peace in the 21st century is certainly a bit abstract. So being a bit personal can be a way to bring a question down to earth and can help making sense of it for people, for an audience. So this is what I'll try to do this evening. You will have noticed that the title of my presentation is not simply International Dialogue and Peace in the 21st Century. The title that I gave to my presentation is Beyond the Culture of Fear and Insecurity, International Dialogue and Peace in the 21st Century. And with this title, I mean simply two things. To begin with, I mean that international dialogue and peace is very much about moving beyond, or should be very much about moving beyond overcoming a state of fear and insecurity. In addition, with this title, I mean to argue that the pursuit of international dialogue and peace should need to take place by factoring in the psychology and emotions of actors who have been at war and subsequently are seeking peace through dialogue. So against this background, I propose to organize my presentation around four main points. First, I will argue that the quest for international dialogue and peace requires partners. That is to say, the right partners. Not everybody is fit for and interested in ending war, fear and insecurity, and pursuing dialogue and peace. Second, assuming that we are dealing with people who are truly interested in dialogue and peace, I will say that the quest for dialogue and peace calls for mobilizing a psychological approach, an understanding of the ways of thinking and feeling of the parties that have been at war and that are now seeking peace through dialogue. In a way, that is, the need to mobilize psychology and emotions is the core of my argument on dialogue for peace, dialogue and peace. We could call it the psychology of dialogue and peace. Third, I would refer to two examples of post-conflict situations that, in my opinion, illustrate how half-baked dialogue and reconciliation among parties previously at war accounts for rather unstable and fragile peace. And the two cases I have chosen concern the Balkans and Sino-Japanese relations. And fourth and finally, as a way to conclude, I will suggest some ways through which nurturing a stronger sense of dialogue could make peace among and within nations, within and among nations, more of a possibility in the years ahead. So this is my roadmap, okay? So let me begin with the simple idea that for international dialogue and peace to be an option, we need partners. We need the right partners. We need the right partners, that is to say we need people, leaders, interested in truly exploring and pursuing the possibility of an authentic dialogue and peace. And at the outset, we have to recognize that not everybody is interested in this. Not all people, not all leaders are truly trying to get involved in a serious dialogue and to achieve a stable peace. In fact, there are political leaders whose human and political makeup has come to turn so pathological, so geared towards violence and terror brought to others being either other nations or even their own people, that it is really a waste of time to negotiate and dialogue with them and try to establish a real sense of peace. Dictators are often of this type. I would argue that Hitler was one such leader, probably one of the worst ever. More recently, Saddam Hussein in Iraq, Gaddafi in Libya, and perhaps El-Assad in Syria correspond also to this type, although on a lesser level of evil, perhaps. So with such people, dialogue is not really a possibility and does not make much sense. In fact, it is probably the removal that is a first step towards dialogue, and then, if the conditions are met, peace. So this is my first point. For international dialogue and peace to be possible, we need to have partners. We need to have the right partners. So now let me turn to my second point, what I call the psychology of dialogue and peace. And as the expression indicates, my idea here is to make psychology, i.e. understanding how people think, how people feel, and how this impacts their actions and beliefs throughout society. So my idea here is to make psychology an important aspect of the process of international dialogue and the quest for peace. And in order to make this point, I want to stress two elements here. First, there is the fact that traditionally, official mechanisms of peace building and country reconstruction leave little room for the human or psychological dimensions of reconciliation. Second, there is the fact that unless the importance of the human and psychological dimensions of reconciliation is first recognized, second understood, and three made an integral part of the process of country reconstruction after war. So unless we have this, I tend to think that there is little chance to embark on a true international dialogue and achieve a sense of stable peace. So let me begin here with a few words on official peace building and country reconstructions. As Professor Chatterjee mentioned earlier, for a number of years, I worked for the UN, including as a member of the speechwriting team of Dr. Boutros Ghali, who was then Secretary General of the UN in the 90s. In this context, I got involved, of course, very much as a junior person. At the time, I was still young. It's all gone. So in this context, I got involved in helping, really simply helping, to address the various conflicts of the period that the UN had, in part, the responsibility to try to stop. And then I was also involved in the processes of peace building and country reconstruction once the conflicts had stopped. And in this regard, one of the many things that surprised me at the time was that not only very little attention was given to the human and psychological dimensions of the conflicts, but also that very little attention was given once the war was over to such human and psychological dimensions in the context of the UN-led peace building and country reconstruction efforts. During the conflicts, the emphasis was very much on formal diplomacy, on whether to use force or not, or on coercing or not parties at war into diplomatic and political negotiations. And after the conflicts, the emphasis was on creating new and better institutions, helping the economic development of the countries, prosecuting the criminals, including via the international ad hoc tribunals set up by the UN, like the tribunals for former Yugoslavia and for Rwanda. And of course, all these things are very important, are crucial, but they are not enough. They are not enough to encourage a serious dialogue and establish peace if they are not accompanied by a real effort of examination, including of self-examination, meant to help understand the psychology and the emotions that led to violence and war, as well as to understand the psychology and emotions that could lead to the establishment of peace. So now let me say a few words about these human and psychological dimensions, which I say are so important to initiate and conduct a true dialogue with oneself and others, and in the end, make durable peace more of a possibility. And what I mean here by the human and psychological dimensions of dialogue and peace is quite simple. It comes down to the 5 following sets of ideas, or theses, if I may use here this somewhat pretentious term of thesis. So first ideas, first thesis, if you will, when one is at peace with oneself, that is, when one has a good dialogue with oneself, with who he or she is, with what he or she aspires to be and do, with what he or she wants and can get from life, I think that chances are that one is likely to be at peace with others. The quality of what we could call inner peace and dialogue that one has with oneself contributes to shape the quality of the relationships of dialogue and peace one has with others. So this is my first idea on this idea of psychology and emotions and dialogue and peace. Second thesis, second idea, of course, the contrary is equally true. When one is at war with himself or herself, when one does not like or accept who he or she is, chances are that one will be at war with others, that his or her relationship with others will be colored by tensions and conflicts. War within is prone to go hand in hand, with war with others. So, in other words, and to put it simply, when I am happy with and about myself, it will be relatively easy to get along well with others. On the other hand, when I am not happy with myself, it's not going to be easy to be happy with and about others. So, I'm just putting forward the idea here of dialogue with oneself, dialogue with others. Third thesis, third idea, when I talk about war and peace within, I do not refer to a phenomenon that happens exclusively within actors. The ability to be happy or not, to have a good dialogue or not with oneself and others, to be at peace or not with oneself and others, is not an entirely internal phenomenon. Since we are born, we constantly interact with others, and it is this interaction and our ability to manage it well or not. It is this ability to manage it well or not that contribute to shape peace and war internally and externally. I believe neuroscientists refer to this process as one of life and emotions regulation, which is key for survival. This is my third idea. Fourth thesis, the dialogue and peace with oneself and others, and the lack of dialogue and peace with oneself and others are states of mind and states of heart that are accompanied by emotions and passions. A person at ease with herself and others, a person in a good relationship of dialogue and peace with herself and others will, I think, embody and convey positive emotions and passions, such as healthy sense of contentment, sense of acceptance, sense of solidarity, openness to others, etc. Respect for others, empathy for others will also perhaps come relatively easy to this person. On the other hand, a person at odds with herself and others will be, I think, by definition, experiencing negative emotions and passions towards herself and others, such as fear, insecurity, frustration, anger, resentment, etc. Moreover, a person who is scared, a person who is shaped by fear and a sense of psychological insecurity, will not be prone to enter into a dialogue and a search for peace through dialogue. For in order to enter into a dialogue, one has to be strong enough, one has to be self-assured enough. After all, in a dialogue, one could discover that his or her point of view is wrong, that he or she should change his or her point of view, and of course, this requires strength, this requires human strength. In fact, this shows that dialogue and peace are at the same time what allows overcoming fear and insecurity, but also what is required to overcome fear and insecurity. And this is why the connection between psychology and emotions on the one hand and dialogue and peace on the other hand is so important and yet so challenging. And this is why also it was important for me to include fear and insecurity in the title of my presentation. Finally, fifth thesis or fifth idea, these human and psychological realities play a big role not only at the individual level, within and among people, but also at the collective and political levels, within and among groups and nations. And in a way, this should not surprise us, because groups and nations, after all, are made of people, right? So in a nutshell, this is the core of my argument on psychology, emotions, dialogue, and peace. And here the bottom line is the following. There is no way one is going to understand and achieve dialogue and peace if one is entirely blind and deaf to these human and psychological realities. These psychological realities are not all there is to dialogue and peace, individual and collective, national and international, but it is a very significant part of it. So now, before I refer to two recent examples of post-conflict situations to illustrate how off-baked dialogue and reconciliation within and among parties previously at war accounts for a rather unstable and fragile peace, let me say how I came to think that psychology, ways of thinking that are also ways of feeling, play such a big role or big part in the possibility and ability to pursue and achieve dialogue and peace. And here I think that telling a bit about the history of my thinking is useful for two reasons. To start with, as I said in my introduction, at times sharing how we come to think what we think can help the audience, you, me, to make sense of an issue. In addition, I think that it is important also because in the US context, when it comes to US academia, be it in political science or in international relations or even in philosophy, not enough attention, I think, is given to the role that psychology and emotions play in matters of war and peace. And even in the US policy context, be it nationally and internationally, not much thinking, at least this is my opinion, goes into understanding the psychology of violence and therefore of nonviolence. And in this regard, the Tanner Center and its preoccupations for nonviolence are very much a rarity in the American academic and policy landscape, which makes the existence of the center and its initiatives all the more crucial. In any case, as far as I can recall the history of my own thinking on the topic, at least three elements played a role in shaping my thoughts, which are still, of course, in development, on issues of dialogue and peace, of international dialogue and peace. As you may have guessed by my accent, I grew up in Europe, in France to be more specific, and it happens that in France, like often in Europe, in the last year of high school, students have to study philosophy, which I think is a good thing. And it is in the context of my high school class of philosophy that I got to be introduced to the importance of psychology for the study of war and peace. I remember being introduced to Spinoza and Nietzsche, two philosophers, whom we could call, in fact, philosopher-psychologists. So two philosophers very much interested in the psychology behind our value systems. Two philosophers very much interested also in what it takes for people to embrace positive emotions and passions, as well as positive values and behaviors. I remember as well studying the philosopher-psychologist Freud, who called upon psychoanalysis as a way to think and try to explain the phenomena of violent collective behavior and of war. So that's one element in my history, or in the history of my thinking on the topic. The second element that led me to be interested in the connection between psychology, emotions, and conflict, and therefore dialogue and peace, is the fact that when I was growing up, when I was a student in France, trying to make sense of Nazism, of the Holocaust, and more generally of ideologies advocating violence and the elimination of others, was a major intellectual and human preoccupation. A major question was, how do we explain that a political regime like Nazism came to think that it was okay to exterminate people by the millions? And here another question was, what were the individual and collective psychologies and the individual and collective pathologies behind the policies of extermination? And this is a question that remains intensely relevant in Europe today. There is not a year when multiple books are not published in a variety of European languages to try to decipher and understand this enigma. And myself, I'm currently developing a book on emotions and international politics, which in part tries to address this issue. And then finally, as I alluded to earlier, my own professional experience with the UN led me to be convinced that unless we understand the psychology of murder and killing, unless we make it part of the quest for international dialogue and peace, I think we run the risk of failing in bringing about better relations within and among people and altogether better world. And so this brings me to the third section of my presentation, that of historical examples illustrating how off-baked dialogue and reconciliation with oneself and among parties previously at war accounts for a rather unstable and fragile peace. And here I want to allude to two cases, the Balkans and the contemporary Sino-Japanese tensions. Each in their own way, these two cases, although they are very, very different, of course, are defining for the current era. And they are indicative of the problems, I think, encountered by processes of international dialogue and peace when these do not take seriously enough the considerations I mentioned earlier concerning the psychology of war and peace. And so here let me begin with the Balkans and the conditions of international dialogue and peace. And in this regard, what is particularly striking about the wars in the Balkans in the 90s and the massive crimes that were committed in their context is the following. The people who ordered and committed these crimes didn't see themselves as criminals or perpetrators. In fact, they saw themselves as victims. That was very much the case of the Bosnian Serb side towards the Bosnian Muslim population, or of the Serb side in Kosovo. And of course, I should add here that this state of affairs is not specific to the Balkans. In fact, it is often that criminals committing crimes do not see themselves as criminals, but as victims. In the process, perpetrators do not have to take responsibility for their crimes. It's always the fault of others, including of the victim. In any case, in this perspective, in the Balkans, the Serbian sides of war identified with a victim mentality, with having been wronged and continuing to be wronged by history. This led them to think and feel that they were justified in engineering ethnic cleansing in Bosnia and then in Kosovo, that they were not committing crimes. So again, this background, my question is, how well have the processes of international dialogue and reconciliation that have taken place at the end of the Balkan Wars, in the second half of the 90s for Bosnia and in the early 2000s for Kosovo, how well did they try to tackle and overcome this victim mentality on the part of the perpetrators? Well, I would argue not very well. And of course, needless to say, this is a problem. Surely, the growing anchoring of the Balkans in the European Union project, what we call the European Union project, is helping to move beyond the traumas of the past. But if the European project were to falter, which is always a possibility, now more than ever, and if its ability to help integrate the Balkans were to weaken, we would see very quickly the tensions among communities rising again, and that the current peace is a highly unstable one. Now, what about my second example, the Sino-Japanese tensions? These tensions are particularly important considering that they could lead, in the worst-case scenario, to a conflict, but also because of the rising global profile of China in the past 20 years. So concerning these Sino-Japanese tensions, I guess that you have all read in the newspapers or seen on TV that in these days they seem to be increasing. As you may know, the immediate source of the tension is a dispute over who of Japan or China has legitimate sovereignty over a bunch of small islands in the South China Sea. And the dispute takes place against the background of China's growing assertiveness in the region and issues of access to natural resources presumed to exist at the bottom of the South China Sea. But of course, such dispute is only the tip of the iceberg. Like between the Korean Peninsula and Japan, China-Japan tensions have to be understood in light of unresolved, decades-long issues. And here, having lived in Japan for a few years and spending quite a bit of time in China, I have come to think that at the bottom of the problems between China and Japan are not simply material and national interest considerations. Of course, these considerations are very important, no doubt about it. But equally important is the sense of psychological insecurity that both countries have towards their standing in the world, the region, one another, and ultimately themselves. The relationship between the two countries is colored by resentment, lack of trust, sense of insecurity, and fear. And in this regard, I tend to think that the inability of China and Japan to come to terms with their respective own history, their respective own identity, with their shared past and mutual relations, is key to the lack of proper constructive dialogue and appeased relations between the two countries. So let me quickly illustrate this by focusing on Japan. Japan has repeatedly apologized for its crimes in Asia, including to China and Korea, for its crimes prior to World War II and during World War II. And yet these apologies have never managed to put the past behind and help establishing a good international dialogue and an atmosphere of trust and peace in the region. Why? Well, I tend to believe, as I alluded to earlier in my presentation, that reconciliation with others is not going to work unless there is reconciliation with oneself. Reconciliation with oneself is a precondition for reconciliation with others. Dialogue and peace with others is not going to be real if each of the countries involved in the dialogue and the peace process is not also entering into a dialogue with itself about itself. I tend to think that this is crucial. And in this context, focusing on Japan, it is as if Japan had never been able to move beyond its own victim mentality, because this is part of the modern Japanese identity, and accept full responsibility for its actions in the region. Hence, its repeated apologies not being seen as truly genuine. So what remains, in fact, its ambiguous attitude towards what we call the issue of comfort women is one illustration among many of the state of affairs. Of course, this is not to say that the other side is perfect. In fact, China and the two Koreas have their own problems. They themselves are not entirely honest about their past and past attitudes. But the result is that we have in Northeast Asia a very fragile international dialogue and peace and deep tensions and frustrations at work. So, where does all this leave us for the way forward concerning international dialogue and peace in the 21st century? So it is with answering or trying to answer this question that I want to end my presentation. And here I would like to make two quick main points. First, I would like to mention some of the specific conditions of the 21st century, if you will, and what this means for conflicts and the attempts to overcome them through international dialogue and peace. Second, I will put forward a few recommendations that perhaps will allow us to understand and integrate, more than it has been the case in the past, the psychology of war and peace in order to pursue and achieve more successful scenarios of international dialogue and peace. So before giving a few recommendations for the way forward, it may be useful to highlight some of the specific characteristics of tensions and conflicts in the early years of the 21st century. These characteristics are not entirely new. They have been at work for a while, but it seems as if they are deepening, or they have been deepening in the past years. And here, just for sake of argument, I'm not planning and pretending to be comprehensive, of course, I will just mention 4 of them. First, one of the growing sources of instability and conflict today is, paradoxically, the fact that the world is becoming more and more integrated, that people are getting closer to one another due, for instance, to great economic integration and interdependence. Now, far from being only a source of integration, this growing closeness is also a source of disintegration. Among other things, people feel challenged by others becoming so close, and their lives so intertwined, so interdependent. And this is all the more the case, considering that the growing closeness of people is taking place in the context of increased competition among regions, countries, and cultural models. The second characteristic is the fact that although people are getting closer and more interdependent, it seems to me that they are less and less inclined, geared towards trying to understand others' point of view. Clearly, this attitude cannot be a good recipe for authentic international dialogue and peaceful relations with others. Third characteristic, there are the modalities of contemporary war themselves and what they are destined to mean for the pursuit of international dialogue and peace. The traditional modalities of war, with countries fighting, armies colliding on the battlefield, and clear front lines between civilians and military actors, tend to be less and less part of the norms and daily realities of war. And so as a result, among other things, this evolution, rather than bringing greater security, generates a greater sense of insecurity, if not paranoia. And so obviously, this evolution cannot be overlooked for the future of international dialogue and peace. Fourth and finally, one of the specificities, I think, of the 21st century when it comes to war and therefore dialogue and peace is the fact that more than in the past, there is a greater expectation for peace. Before, conflicts were more or less viewed as a fact of life. Now, the values, institutions, and ways of functioning of the developed world are such that they are geared towards making major conflict more the exception than the norm. The creation of the UN can be understood, interpreted, viewed in this light. So, not surprisingly, these characteristics are destined to have an impact on the value and modalities of dialogue and peace. So, for instance, the changing conditions of war are meant to also have an impact on the pursuit of international dialogue and peace. So again, this background, what could be the recommendations to put forward in order to enhance the possibility and success of international dialogue and peace? Well, as a way to conclude, I don't want to keep you too late here. You have other things to do. 5 recommendations come to mind. First, the institutions and institutional frameworks of international dialogue and peace are important, of course. Diplomatic negotiations, as it happened a few days ago in Geneva for Syria, confidence-building measures, development initiatives to reconstruct countries after conflicts, all these initiatives are, of course, very, very important. But they should not lead to forgetting about or overlooking the human dimensions of conflict and of peace. What in the human and psychological makeup of people triggers them to go to war? What makes them search for peace? So these questions, for example, have to be properly analyzed and understood for dialogue and peace to be possible. Second, a quasi-exclusive military focus in the handling of conflicts is not necessarily conducive to afterwards reverting to dialogue to achieve sustainable peace. Think about Iraq today. In principle, the war is over, peace has been more or less restored, and yet the number of people being killed every day is rising again. In fact, nothing, or close to nothing, is probably solved in Iraq. Tomorrow, we will probably also discover that it is the same in Afghanistan. Third idea, suggestion, recommendation, how do we cultivate values, emotions, and passions of dialogue and peace, not only in situations of crisis, not only among nations, but every day in our daily lives as citizens? I think we have to think about this question and try as much as possible to answer it. Fourth recommendation, there is the need to be more reflective. As I said earlier, the ability to dialogue properly with others, to be at peace with others, is to a large extent based on the ability to dialogue properly with oneself, to be at peace with oneself. This is a thing called honesty or integrity. And I think we need more of this. And to achieve more of this, we need to reflect, we need to self-reflect more about ourselves as individuals and as nations. Here, the bottom line is that we cannot see and listen properly to others if we're not seeing and listening honestly, properly to ourselves. I think it's as simple and yet as complicated as this. Fifth and finally, universities, academic centers like the Tanner Center, local communities have a huge role to play when it comes to all these suggestions. These suggestions about ethos, education, and knowledge. And these cannot happen without the commitment of each of us in our professions and lives. So as you can see, we have a lot of work ahead of us. But this is good work because it is meaningful work. I think I'll stop here. I thank you for your attention, and I'll be happy to try to answer your questions. Thank you.
I will start.
Okay.
If no one else wants to. I very much enjoyed your presentation and the, for me, surprising focus on sort of an individual level dialogue with the self as a precursor to peace. But I wonder if you could connect that to institutional frameworks a little bit more. I guess as you were talking, I was thinking about peace and reconciliation processes. You think about South Africa as maybe an example of an institutional framework that does what you suggest is necessary, sort of encourages uncovering history, encourages a clear reflection on the underlying causes of these things. Are there other kinds of institutional frameworks that you've thought about that sort of facilitate this?
Initially, in my presentation, I had 4 cases. And then Dean told me, you should not go beyond 40 minutes. So I cut it down. So I got rid of 2 cases. One was Rwanda, and the other one was South Africa. And I know that the tradition has been to present South Africa as a success story. I tend to think that the transition process in South Africa has been a failure. Yes, it is true that on the one hand, we have moved from an apartheid regime to a so-called non-apartheid regime today without war. But I don't think that peace has been achieved in the process. The level of daily violence today in South Africa tells me that something is wrong and that something hasn't been addressed in the transition process. So that would be my answer. Mm-hmm.
Do you think that the UN itself needs to be in a way of policing actually the world, or actually taking policy and looking at it in a world of peace? I would base the question of saying that the UN as a sanction itself, being with all of the nations together with that, do you allow a sense of actual governing and policing, or do you allow an observance?
Well, in principle or normative terms, the UN, along with member states, had the responsibility of, of ensuring collective security. So this is from a normative and principle point of view. In operational terms, the UN doesn't have the means to fulfill this mandate. So that's why I always say that the UN is not a global organization or a field organization. It's essentially a headquarters organization. So, on paper, based on the charter, the principles, based on norms, the UN is meant to contribute, not alone, but to contribute to collective security, which is one of the other ways to talk about policing, quote unquote, the world. But in operational terms, the UN doesn't have the means to do that. I mean, the disaster that peacemaking, what we called in the 90s, peacemaking was in the Balkans, is an illustration of this very humbling reality. Oh, no, okay, sorry. It's a short answer to a long and difficult question.
You, excuse me.
Oh, sorry.
This internal peace necessary to create external peace. Mm-hmm. The internal dialogue personally and the internal dialogue domestically. Mm-hmm. Does this theory then suggest that there has to be universal domestic peace before we have a global peace?
I don't have an answer to this difficult question. But I mean, what I know, a few years ago, I was asked to write an article on the politics of apology. And when people, write and think about the politics of apology, it's always in the context of reconciliation, right? And when people think and talk about reconciliation, the focus has mainly been about, reconciling or trying to reconcile two actors who have been at war, right? And having worked at the UN, but also, and for me that was very enlightening, spent years a few years in Japan, and dealing with Japanese and Chinese matters and so on, I came to think that, in fact, reconciliation between two actors is not going to happen if each of these two actors doesn't work on itself and really enter into a dialogue with itself as a way to really, address its own, we could use the expression, psychotherapy as applied to politics. I mean, for instance, China and Taiwan would be perhaps in need of political psychotherapy, and many other places in the world. I mean, China and Japan for sure. But I mean, so I came to think that, while the focus when we talk about reconciliation is always the need to bring together these two actors who had been at war, equally important, if not more, is the need for each of these two actors to reflect, self-reflect about themselves and so on. So it's not, and once again, the process of self-reflection, as I said in the presentation, is not an entirely internal one, because, as I said, we are by definition, by essence, social beings. We construct our identity out of, since we are born, interacting with others. But I wanted to stress, the need to self-reflect as a way to communicate properly with others, because this is something which I think tend to be overlooked, forgotten, especially in the context of, diplomacy. Because once again, the focus is very much on bringing these two enemies together via formal institutional mechanisms. And of course, as I said, these mechanisms are very, very important, but unless they are really, accompanied by a work on oneself, it's not going to work. I mean, you see this in the Balkans, you see this, everywhere. I think, that's my take on these things. That's why I prefaced my presentation by indicating that it would be a personal take and account of these issues. But I don't think that I'm entirely wrong, if I may say so.
One more question. you've talked a lot about, the need for political psychotherapy. That's a great term. Do you have any historical cases where that's been done successfully after a conflict that are shining examples, if you will? Or is that something that is still needing to be implemented?
Colleagues who have been, colleagues from the UN who have been more in the field than me. In fact, I'm not a field person. When I was working for Boutros, I was, supposedly the historian philosopher in residence. Which of course I was not, but that was part of my job. But colleagues who spent a lot of years in the field told me that, for instance, East Timor on this account was an interesting case, and partly because in East Timor or in Southeast Asia, there is a spiritual dimension which leads people to reflect more and to have perhaps a stronger sense of agency in face of adversity that perhaps in the West we have lost. This colleague had spent time both in the Balkans and in East Timor, and he was saying that this spiritual process, quote unquote, was more happening in East Timor than it was happening in the Balkans, where people tended to be stuck in this victim mentality.
Hi, I'm up here. Thank you. So I have a question. Let me just preface this. I'm really trying to understand, of course, the suggestions that you're trying to put forward, but I'm trying to assess the viability of it, considering the systemic framework of the international community, especially by the United Nations. So you're proposing a psychological framework of looking into conflict and trying to
I'm saying that it's part
rehabilitate
of
actors.
I'm saying that it's part of the story.
It's part of the story, right?
Yeah, I'm not saying that it's the whole story.
And I think it's something that things like constructivism or transformative cosmopolitanism look into. But here's the deal. The one thing I'm really interested in is how viable is it considering our current framework, or whether the framework has to be changed in a way fundamentally. I say this. I worked this last summer with the Nansen Dialogue Center in Norway, in Lillehammer. And they work a lot with the Balkans, for example. And one of the principles of dialogue, right, and having a constructive dialogue, is moving away from positional interaction into interest-based interaction, right? Now, I'm going to make an assumption that liberal democratic politics, by nature, because of its majority rule and the politics of power, etc., necessitates actors to interact with each other based on positional basis. So in the United Nations, for example, we talk a lot about reform because all these different actors cannot come to agreement about certain matters, but they're really talking many times in positional, they're relating to each other positionally. So we're talking about dialogue, right? And dialogue just doesn't seem compatible with the current framework. So I'm wondering whether you think it's viable considering the current structure of the United Nations and perhaps a lot of the regional institutions to have dialogue and psychology-based introduction into resolving conflict, considering that it doesn't support it systemically.
No, I'm not saying that the factoring in the psychological and emotional dimension is the whole story. I'm saying that it's part of the story and it's an important part which has been forgotten or which is overlooked. Well, I'll give you a simple example of what could be done. In fact, I started as a diplomat. My first career track was serving as a French diplomat. And I don't know why we leave diplomacy only to diplomats. Because diplomats are not necessarily the best to handle a conflict situation, let alone a negotiation situation, because very often diplomats are very narrowly focusing on the interests of their country. So, simple example, on a negotiation team, why is it that we only have diplomats when diplomats are not necessarily the best people to successfully pursue diplomacy? Example. I don't know, maybe it's just an idea. Yeah.
Do you think that the presence of democracy helps or not?
Mm-hmm. It depends. I mean, it depends. I was lucky enough to study a few years ago, many years ago, with Philippe Allot, who is a wonderful philosopher and philosopher of law who used to teach at Cambridge, and he has written a very interesting book called Anomia, which is about precisely the ability of societies to self-create and how, in fact, democracies have this ability to self-create more than any other regimes. And one of the key points that he makes in the book is that while democratic values are of great value for the fact that they are what they are, we have to make sure that they are not about self-righteousness, that therefore that they are able to embody and put forward a self-critical and self-reflective dimension. So my answer to you is twofold. Yes, democracy is a great tool as long as it is not self-righteous. And very often, in fact, democracy, and Western democracy, including American democracy, which is an outgrowth of European democracy, all too often tends to be self-righteous. And then we enter, we run into problems. I think, I don't know.
Up here, I just got a question. When you talked about...
Does it make sense, sir? Does it make sense? Yeah.
When you talk about American democracy, and the first thing that comes to my mind is war in Iraq, where it seems that basically American foreign policy doesn't look into anything you talked about, inner peace, external peace, or anything like that. They attack the country based off of fake evidence and all that. And can you elaborate on UN role in stopping potentially, now we're talking about attacking Syria, North Korea is always in the news, Iran is the hot topic, so it seems like there's at the moment, just a cycle of today we're going to attack this country, then we're going to move on to this country, and living in a country that is the only country who ever used nuclear power, do you think that current foreign policy of U.S. is a threat to world peace?
Let me think about it. Well, because the U.S. is a global power and a global democratic power, I think that it has enormous responsibility. And whatever it does, which undermines the international system, goes against its interest and the one of the world. So that's the framework that I am using when I think about these things. My answer could be, I don't know, I haven't thought about the US as a threat to world peace. When I reflect a little bit on Western history, modern Western history, the history of the West towards the rest of the world since the late 15th century, I tend to think that history has been of two sides. On the one hand, it has been highly predatory. On the other hand, it has been highly humanistic. And I think that the West, in its relationship with the rest of the world, hasn't been able to decide which of these two directions, which of these two paths, which of these two identities should be the one with which it should identify first and foremost. So you have a constant oscillation. And for many, many years, a few centuries, that was the oscillation of continental Europe, then of Britain, and then maybe it's the oscillation of the US today. So that would be my answer. At the same time, a pillar of world peace, a consolidator of world peace, and yet at the same time, and this is a paradox, an underminer of its own peace and of world peace. So, clearly, we are coming at a point where we are at the crossroads, so we will have to make a choice. I don't know. This is an attempt to answer your question.
I think you have a great point about victimization, and I think 9/11 the U.S. felt the victim, and so we need to have an internal dialogue in the U.S. like you've been talking about.
And I don't think that this dialogue has taken place.
How do we nurture that dialogue?
It's interesting. I have a friend, his name is Henri Rousseau, and writes very interesting things on, his books are available in English, on memory and trauma in the context of the Holocaust. And he was asked to serve as a consultant for the museum, which has been put together in downtown New York City. And he wanted, the advice that he gave to the people who were putting together this museum was, why don't you try to use this opportunity as a way to have this conversation, right? And that was not really the philosophy which was embraced for the putting together of this museum. So in a way, you see, one could argue that September 11 was for the US a missed opportunity in terms of having this, internal dialogue. That's what I would argue.
But how do you nurture that? How do you get it going? It's like it doesn't happen.
No, I know, but it's a tough question. I don't have an answer. The fact of the matter is that the US, as a national culture, is not very self-reflective. So how do you nurture historical self-reflection? I'm always amazed by the fact that, for instance, the US, contemporary US, is a major history actor at the world level today, and yet there is very, very few things being produced on the US philosophy of history by specialists as well as public intellectuals, and yet there is a philosophy of history which is being written and which is being projected, and yet the people for whom it would be their job to think about these things, they don't write on it. And for me, this is an expression of an overall cultural trait. But I would have to think further on the matter to really, give you a better answer, I guess. But as a way to answer you, and to try to find the answer, I would start here, on these issues. Sir.
I guess I don't need the mic.
Oh, you have a strong voice.
Your response to the question about...
Wait for the mic.
I do need the mic. Your response to the question about positionality and the blockage to the kind of conversation that you're speaking of forces me to examine where is it that that positionality originates. And it's difficult for me to imagine creative dialogue arising in all those countries where the dominant positionality is really that of Chevron or Shell or other major corporations which play such a huge role in not only accentuating their own interests but treating the state as the instrument of that goal, and they have the ability to do that. I haven't sat down with Chevron lately, and I don't expect to, and I doubt that dialogue would be very meaningful.
So the question that you bring about is the question of the quality of public discourse, and it's true that it's a very, very serious issue. Gentleman over there.
Thanks very much. Not so much a question, but perhaps a comment. I thought the question that was asked by this lady was a very good one. How do we foster this type of self-reflection that you see as essential to the whole process of making peace? Especially in a situation where it seems that so many of the structures that we have, whether we're talking about diplomacy or international organizations, seem to be very much against that approach. Yeah. There's also a problem, I think, with many of those approaches because they are quite often externally imposed. There's a particular model that is used, and that doesn't often reflect the realities that the people themselves experience. Mm-hmm. But I just wonder whether we can't see this experience itself, the fact that you're here, as being part of this whole process of self-reflection. Yeah. And surely all educational institutions should try and foster a situation where we are aware of our own history and about relations with the rest of the world, for example. So I would see, it sounds very simple, but education, it seems to me, is fundamental to this whole issue, whether we're talking about the kindergarten or universities. And they're also fundamental to democracy. I mean, going back to the issue of Iraq, for instance, I think it becomes crucial for all those people who understand or have studied these issues to actually educate the public about what is involved in these types of circumstances. So, for example, it astonishes me, for instance, because of this whole hostility towards Iran, for instance, that many people don't appreciate the fact that a United States government helped undermine a democratically elected Iranian government. So just a small example to sort of suggest that if people are educated about these issues, hopefully they would think differently and approach things differently.
No, you're absolutely right. But when it comes to universities and education, I think what is key for us to think about, how do we not simply limit ourselves to producing and disseminating what I call intellectual ideology. I mean, what is the difference between knowledge, which is as little ideological as possible, and what I call intellectual ideology? I mean, a few months ago, I was on a panel with the New School, and they were celebrating the openness of U.S. universities. And, U.S. universities, of course, are the most international varies in the world. But they were all, congratulating themselves as if everything was fine, and not everything is fine. I mean, there is also a huge amount of intellectual ideology in the production and dissemination of knowledge, which is not knowledge in the end. And in the fact, and in the process, we don't do our job. We simply, fail ourselves, our students, and our countries in producing knowledge which is so ideological. So how do we make sure that we are not the captive of instrumental knowledge? So that's something also to think about. How do we get as self-reflective and as self-critical as we can be in terms of our own knowledge production?
On the basis of knowledge, I'm a student up in urban planning, and I know that education only goes so far as those who seek it. Mm-hmm. So like I'm up at the U, I have that opportunity, but do you think it's something that could be solved more locally and then move upward as like a basis for trying to obtain peace?
Well, I think what is very much useful in terms of education is the comparative dimension, because the comparative dimension, be it comparative philosophy, comparative ethics, and so on, gives you ways to understand things from a plurality of point of view. And this is not something which is very much cultivated in academia around the world. And if someone was going to ask me my advice, and of course nobody will, I would say, well, make it sure that the comparative dimension across countries in the developed world, as well as across countries between the developed world and the developing world, is part of the story that you are trying to generate and disseminate and pass on to students. I mean, for me, it was an incredible, I grew up in a small village in France. I happened to study partly here, and then I also studied in Latin America and lived in Asia. For me, that was a wonderful learning experience to really be exposed to diversity, because that's how you end up thinking and learning. If you are constantly circulating in the realm of the same, well, you cannot think and you cannot grow. So and there are institutional ways to make this happen, and comparative study is one of them, I think.
Every conflict I know about is one of real conflicts of interest and power. Mm-hmm. And I think these have to be solved if you're going to have stable peace. Mm-hmm. And I'm not against doing psychology as well, but I fear that if you start focusing too much on psychology, you will get diverted from these very real underlying conflicts. So, just get your psychology right, and we don't need to worry about the fact that in South Africa unemployment is huge, inequality is huge, and so on and so forth.
No, that's not what I'm saying. I mean, I said all along, that it's part of the story, but it's not the whole story. And I absolutely agree with you. If you are focusing, once again, the goal is not to to move from one paradigm for another. The goal is not to change paradigm. The goal is to enrich the paradigm of explanation and of understanding. And this, in fact, entails dovetailing better than we have done in the past, the logics of interest and the logics of emotions, for instance. I mean, I just finished a long piece on theories of rights and theories of emotions. Any kind of theory of justice is underwritten by a grammar of emotions, which tends to be, in the Anglo-American world, overlooked. I think this is a mistake. So I'm not saying that this is, what I'm putting forward is not the whole story. It's a small piece of the puzzle. And this would have to be, added to, thinking about interest and so on and so on and so on.
Can I just make one last?
So I was just pushing this button today because I tend to think that we don't think that the button exists, and it exists.
Well, Jean-Marc, I'm quite intrigued by what you said, and obviously, given the level of interest, there's something. But I'm also, should we say, not persuaded, like Frances. I think the same idea, the same question that she raised is also in my head, that there are real problems out there, and one can't just solve it by just saying that thinking a little bit differently. And may I just make two comments. One is that obviously I think the gentleman who gave the Chevron example, Chevron is not interested in psychotherapy, and they are effecting conflict. And so the question really is that, is this only meant for the weak, just to enable them to exist with these conditions, or is there something else going on? That's question number one, if I may. You dismissed the South African example. Now, clearly, one can say that the South African example, they were more or less doing what you said that they would do. Perhaps other things have also gotten worse, and therefore there are problems. But as far as what they did go through this psychotherapy exercise. Number three, Cambodia, which went through an extremely violent period, has always been a peaceful country, and now has gone back to some of its own peaceful ways without going through any of this, what one might call it, a psychological sort of an experience. And then fourth, when I was younger, people would say to me, don't go out with anybody who has had more than 1 year of psychotherapy. Because they lose the capacity of saying, I'm sorry, because they justify themselves. Psychotherapy is a way of justifying yourself. Now, in some sense, and which you actually raised this in one of your later comments, that, really, if all you're doing psychotherapy for is to justify, this self-righteousness, that comes from the same source. So, in some sense, I'm intrigued, but I feel that maybe one needs to focus on what Frances said rather than to...
No. I'm not advocating psychotherapy. I never went through psychotherapy myself, so just to be clear. No, and I think, the challenge here, and it's an intellectual, policy, and political challenge, is to think about, how do we think better about the material dimensions of the world, including interest, and the immaterial one. I mean, I gave the example of China and Japan because I think it's an interesting one. China, I don't know, it's ranked first or second now, Japan fourth. And of course, in these tensions that you find between Japan and China, you have, national interest considerations, but at the same time you have something else. And the two things get married. So and I think we have. I'm just my plea here is simply for us to think in a more refined way on these issues. For instance, historically, the literature on interest has been built on the exclusion of emotions and so on for a number of reasons. And I'm not trying to build a literature on emotions on the exclusion of interest. No, I'm trying to put forward the idea that maybe we have to rethink how the notion of interest is being addressed, lived, and so on, and partly in connection with emotions. So I'm not saying that it's an either-or proposition. I'm just saying that, we have to perhaps make it an this proposition and explore what it means in terms of the dynamics of peace, dynamics of conflict, and so on. That's all. I mean, it's a more perhaps I don't want to give myself credit, but it's an attempt to think perhaps in more sophisticated way on the sociology of conflicts. That's all. But I mean, I don't claim that I have the answers. I'm just, as I said, my thoughts are still, in development.
For one more time, we are going to have an opportunity here for a reception out front. We can continue the conversation there. Thank you very much for your questions and your attention. Thank you.